I had the pleasure of, I'm Danielle, and I had the pleasure of refuting Patrick's speech on circumcision. So the claim I'm responding to is that negatives of male circumcision outweigh the benefits. My opponent's secondary claims were that male circumcision's benefits are exaggerated, that circumcision risks surgical complications, and that circumcision is associated with harm. I apologize in advance if I mess up the word circumcision. It's hard to say over and over. So my response to his claims. First, I'm going to discuss my response to the first claim that the benefits are exaggerated, or that the benefits are exaggerated. It's clear after looking after the cited material that the evidence contradicts the claim. This is especially evident in regards to the examples about HIV risk reduction. First, the arguer highlights that the studies show a 60% relative risk reduction. He often highlighted this word relative. And when I went back to the article, I couldn't find any cite of that word. So I could conclude that he kind of was using that word to persuade us to think that the 60% relative reduction rate was not significant. However, this study was really highly credible. It was with 3,200 participants. The behavioral factors were taken into account, such as like using condoms or not. And it concluded that there was a 60% risk reduction for those who were circumcised in this case, which is a huge number. This is important because it proves the opposite of his claim that this benefit is exaggerated, because 60% risk reduction is not exaggerated. It's a high number. I also looked up some more evidence on this, and the CDC backs this, and it compared 28 trial studies on HIV and circumcision, and also found a high number that there was a 44% risk reduction for those who were circumcised. These facts are important because they prove that the speaker misinterpreted the information and used conflicting evidence to support his claim. In response to the secondary claim that circumcision risks surgical complications, I found that this claim lacked supporting evidence. There was only one article used to support the claim, which was Cultural Biases in American Academy of Pediatrics 2012 Clinical Report and Policy. So basically, this was an article that some doctors wrote that contradict what the AAP was saying about the surgical risk of circumcision. So this article stated that there's a 2% risk of complications from circumcision. So first off, that's a very low number of complications. And after thorough research, I never saw this number again. I actually saw higher numbers. And it seems that though the arguer lacked the thorough research, because this number is actually higher on most sources. The low number of 2% really isn't that high to create a concern. And also Patrick argued that this 2% compared to the HIV risk. So he gave us some ratios that, you know, for every two people who have a complication, one person would be prevented from having a UTI. And he didn't explain what the complications truly were. Were they minor complications? What are the different types of complications, and what are the statistics on those different types? So it's important to acknowledge these ratios, because especially the HIV, for every 8 HIV cases, or for every 8 complications, there was one HIV case that was prevented. So I think anyone in this room would state that they would go for a couple complications if we can prevent one person from having HIV. It's important to acknowledge the lack of sufficient evidence of this claim, because it doesn't persuade the audience that surgical complications really do outweigh the benefits of circumcision. And in response to the third claim that circumcision is associated with harm, first, I really don't think that there's a reason to use this claim as an independent claim. I think that the examples from the circumcision, from the harm of circumcisions were more easily correlated with the surgical risks. This is important to highlight because there really is no third claim. It's kind of an extension of the second claim. So, and second, I think that the articles that the evidence was retrieved from contradicts the claim. The arguer mentioned that circumcision is associated with psychological trauma, that it leads to amputations, and that anesthesia is often not used. And this article actually stated the opposite. It said that there's not enough research on these statements. The same article also states, and also about the anesthesia, Janice Lander, in her clinical trial, states that anesthesia is used. This is the same article that was referenced on the bibliography. Her trial was comparing the different frequently used methods, not stating that it's not used. So anesthesia really is typically used in circumcision, so I thought that was not a valid argument or evidence to support the claim. And overall it seems that the arguer often lacked sufficient evidence to support his claims, and that the articles or studies used to provide supporting evidence contradict the claims he's making. Thank you.
Structurally, everything is fine. On the first point on exaggeration, you kind of challenged the way he's interpreted the evidence and suggested that he's placed the word relative into the argument as a way of selling the idea, but it doesn't really exist in those particular points. I think that's a reasonable argument to make that said that the term relative doesn't appear there, and a 60% reduction is significant. That seems to be your argument. I do think you could use some numbers as a way to illustrate this. So if we, I'd have to sit down and figure it out, but if we're talking about a 60% reduction out of the 3,200 people in that study, that would seem to suggest if half of them were circumcised, half of them weren't circumcised, the chances are that they would get 15 would get HIV infections who were uncircumcised, and only 7 would get HIV if they were circumcised. That's kind of what we're talking about, that, and there's that difference that was mentioned before, and I think that's probably statistic that was talked about, the ratio of 8 to 1 that we had on HIV versus complications. On the second argument on complications, I think you get a little sidetracked here, and maybe potentially dangerously so, by saying that his evidence really underestimates what the potential risks are. He's only using a 2% figure when I found that it was more substantial. I know you seem like you're undermining his credibility on the research. However, the way you're doing it is by proving that it's more dangerous than he actually presents. I don't think that that's the strategy that you want to go for at that. I think the real strategy to go for is the question about what are those risks, and to look at the kinds of data that were talked about there. I have only a vague memory of what kinds of risks he presented. You present none of what those are, and I'm not sure that any of those risks seem particularly significant, especially in contrast to potential HIV infection. So the risks might have been, swelling, they might have been infection, there might have been scarring, there might have been some temporary pain or something like that. Are those in fact the kinds of things that were so onerous and problematic that they present a real danger? Was there any long-term harm from any of those sorts of things? That's, I think, the kind of thing that you needed to have in the argument here, instead of going the direction that you did, which I think, kind of steps in it a little bit. And then your argument that says the third point's really just an extension of the second point, that's perfectly fine if you want to go that direction. I don't know how important that is, but the idea that it's basically the same evidence that we're talking about here. The idea of any risk is not really quantifiable. There's no overall research that talks about what the sacrifice is going to be. And then you do have an argument that talks specifically about anesthesia, and that's fine. It goes way over time, so you got to be careful about that. And when we do the debates, nobody's going over time because we just stop you. All right. So when those come up later on, with the time limits, somebody will say stop, and you're expected to stop because we have to fit in a certain number of debates each night. Okay. Thank you.